I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Today's episode features a return appearance by my Hudson colleague, Dr. Nadia Schadlow. We are discussing her articulation of the idea that there is a crisis of repetition in U.S. national security policy, especially related to the defense industrial base, critical mineral supply chain weaknesses, and infrastructure cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The point of this conversation is that at a certain point, we can, across administrations, recognize that problems exist, but there's been an enormous gap between the recognition of problems and the actual implementation of the fixes to these problems in these critical categories.
Our ability to deter war depends upon our ability to produce what we need to prevail in conflict. And producing what we need requires an industrial base, requires the ability to make the platforms, right? To produce the ammunition, to manufacture the components and the parts. So it is very much linked to the broader strategic imperative of deterring war. And if deterrence should fail, and unfortunately we've seen it fail now twice, right? We've seen it fail in Europe and we've seen it fail in the Middle East. And our ability to deter depends on our ability to convince our adversaries that we actually can produce what we need to fight and win, if we need to.
This builds upon a piece that Nadia wrote in Breaking Defense. You can find that link in the show notes of this episode. It's a great conversation. Huge thanks for joining us on the show. Dr. Nadia Schadlow, welcome back to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you, Marshall. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to chat with you. Last time we spoke was at the December 2023 Reagan Defense Forum, live and in person. We're doing this over Riverside now, so obviously not quite as ideal. But given that it's been more than 6 months since that last conversation, I'd love for you just to give us a current kind of state of play when it comes to the various theaters, regions, news events that really define this conversation.
Yeah, we could probably just spend a whole podcast on that. But clearly, since December, the world has become an even more dangerous place. There's certainly one in which conflicts are intensifying. In Europe, we're seeing unfortunately, a bad turn in the war in Ukraine, with the Ukrainians suffering from serious problems in terms of their ability, partly because of the West, but their ability to gain access to the kinds of weapons and ammunition that they need. We're seeing an intensification of war in the Middle East. We're seeing China's continuing incursions and testing and probing of Taiwan. So I think the world, I think most would agree, is a more dangerous place than it was 6 months ago. And in thinking about that, it's become even more clear that we must, as a country, respond with more agility and more timeliness in the promises that we're making. So, in Ukraine, for example, we've promised and we've provided a lot of assistance to the Ukrainians, but actually identifying what's been delivered when and the purposes of the assistance has been harder, right? There have been gaps, there have been delays, there's been a sense of sort of incrementalism, doing things in small tranches, and all of that has really affected the outcome or the ongoing unfolding of the war there. So it's become really more and more important that we figure out how to solve some of these problems. I think we can, which is the purpose of, I think, the piece that we'll talk about. But we've got to get better at following through on our promises in a timely and efficient manner.
I think that's the perfect pivot to, I think, the other big news item that relates both to the thesis of this show, but you're in my work at Hudson. The Defense Department released a defense industrial base strategy in January. Your piece in Breaking Defense is really responding to some of the dynamics that emerged out of that strategy. But I'd love you to start by kind of contextualizing the strategy for folks and just your general thoughts on the recommendations offered in the actual strategy and what that means for our conversation today.
Right. Thanks, Marshall. So first off, it's great that the department did put together a defense industrial strategy, thinking about the defense industrial base in a strategic way, identifying the problems and the strengths of that base. All of that is good. So I certainly didn't mean to, pick on that strategy because there are a lot of strategies and documents that one could pick on. However, the purpose of the piece really was to show that if we want to make the kinds of improvements in that industrial base, as well as elsewhere throughout the government, we need to recognize what efforts have been tried in the past, right? So that was sort of the impetus for the piece. I called it a crisis of repetition because the elements of the strategy, from the need to reduce our reliance on critical minerals and other supplies, to the need to hire the right kind of workforce. These are issues that have existed for a long, long time. So in reading the strategy, it occurred to me, gee, I should go back and look at how long we have been worried about some of these issues, right? And that's why I sort of chose the critical minerals and the dependencies in that domain as a focus of the article. But again, there are many strategies over the years across administrations that have tended to repeat recommendations from the past. So that's really the heart of this. What can we all do, those of us who are concerned about policy, who work in policy positions, and who comment on the outside about policy? What can we do to avoid that cycle of repetition?
And I really want to contextualize this given the quotes you offered in the piece. There are three quote unquote good recommendations in the strategy that you called out. So one, reducing supply chain vulnerabilities, developing the American workforce, and then of course, improving cybersecurity within critical infrastructure. The kind of problem that we're identifying here is that at this point, I call this the kind of my version of this piece is the we get it problem. You could have written 15 different, and there have been 15 different op-eds on all those three categories since basically COVID, really made very, very clear, especially in the cyber, critical infrastructure, and supply chain vulnerability category. So the question here is that how do we translate the repetition problem you're actually talking about into actual action? So let's zoom in then on the history of reporting and like writing and thought leadership around the critical mineral category. Like maybe just define the problem that we're all like writing and talking about, and how have various bipartisan administrations thought about that problem over the past decade or so.
Yeah. And I mean, I could do the same in a sort of small capsule on the critical infrastructure part two. Which you just mentioned, because that was a key part of the report. So, just as a sidebar, in April of 2024, so just a month ago, we had the FBI director commenting on how China, he expressed concern about China's intrusions into our critical infrastructure. And if you go back, those very same weaknesses and vulnerabilities, you can find the same all the way back to the Clinton administration, 1996, if you look at executive orders from that period, and even before that period. But basically from 1996 on, you'll see the same pattern of concerns by Republican and Democratic administrations about vulnerabilities in our critical infrastructure. So there are many examples, but I'll turn to critical minerals because that was the subject of the piece. So since 1980, we identified deficiencies in our critical mineral base. In other words, the ability to get these minerals, the ability to access them was really dependent on outside sources. So since 1980, although after writing the piece, I actually found that I probably could have gone back to the 1970s and had evidence to bear. I didn't update the piece, but the problem actually existed in the 1970s. So in 1982, for instance, the department expressed the view that our dependencies would become worse over the next 2 decades. So that was in 1982. They were worried about the next 20 years. In the 1990s, the State Department and the Defense Department both agreed that we were vulnerable to foreign suppliers on this, and that we needed to look at the problem and do something about the problem. In 2011, Congress called it a crisis. And if you go through from the 2011 through 2017 period, you'll see several key reports across the executive branch and Congress on this topic. And then if you fast forward to the Trump administration, in 2017, there was an executive order on the topic. 2 years later, a similar executive order on the topic, calling our vulnerabilities a national emergency. And then fast forward to the Biden administration, which completed significant studies documenting our vulnerabilities in the area of critical and rare earth minerals. So that's a lot of evidence, a lot of recommendations, many of them the same over the years. So I think the key now, and I know that you're a problem solver, and I like the way that you think about the world, Marshall, because you think about implementation and getting things done. That's your frame, I think, for a lot of your programming. So I welcome now.
Thank you. That's a good editorial statement for listeners. This is what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, no, it's a very practical podcast, which I like.
So I think the next question then is, I'd love to hear then your understanding as a person who is obviously looking at these things from a think tank outside perspective, but also worked in government. What is your understanding then of what happened 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s? Where is this gap between everyone recognizing there's a problem and just taking actions to address those problems? Because you critically argue that what we're describing here isn't a structural problem. But typically for me, when you find across almost half of a century, across multiple administrations, across different eras of national security challenges, if we're kind of running into the same crisis of repetition, that suggests this is structural. So why do you argue this actually is not a structural problem?
I mean, I think that's a great question. And I could be wrong. And actually, I'd welcome listeners to come back and say, no, Nadia, you're actually really wrong about this. This is structural. But I really did try to find structural problems here. I asked many former high-level officials, many of whom had years in Congress, for instance, executive branch officials also who spent years as quite high up in their departments. Is this problem structural? Is there something in the nature of the law or the nature of your department's regulations that are really preventing or creating this crisis of repetition? And I was not able to find one, right? But it's funny because, as an aside, I had some arguments with some editors who will go unnamed about this issue, right? People pushing back and saying to me, no, Nadia, it's structural. So I don't think it is. I'll go through the four problems that I do think we need to address, and then we can go from there. So first, it's really a problem of how a policymaker sort of thinks about his or her job. So the first, it's easy to go in to a new position, and it's exciting to say, I have a lot of new ideas. Now that I'm in a new policy position, I'm going to have a chance to advance these new important ideas. That's human nature, right? That's also sort of what makes policy jobs exciting. I succumb to that. I think everyone has that approach. They should be excited about the new job. The tendency, however, is not to go back and begin with aggregating what went wrong, previously, right? How many recommendations exist in your particular domain in the past? What's the aggregation of those recommendations? So I think that there's a tendency first not to aggregate the sets of recommendations that have existed in the past. Now, I don't think that's a structural problem. I think that's a problem of leadership. I think it's a problem of just making leaders aware that first step is an important one, aggregation. Compile what's been done in the past. Across all of those reports that I mentioned, for instance, from 1980, we now have the capability with data to actually go through all of them, lift the recommendations, and put them down on a policymaker's desk and say, sir, ma'am, here are 33 recommendations on how to reduce our dependency on critical minerals. Many of them overlap, and they've been, around since 1980. So that's the first step. But what do you think, Marshall?
No, I agree. And I think the key, and this is where I kind of approach this from a policy perspective, the leadership aspect is just key here. It's an expectations. And this is why I agree with you on the structural nature of it, is that I think that a part of the problem that we're encountering at a policymaking perspective is we're just requiring policymakers to look at these problems from a new perspective, from, okay, our job is to not even just think big thoughts in a dismissive way, but like really spend our time conceptualizing the problem. What does the era of great power competition look like? What does the US relationship with China look like? What does our end game in Ukraine look like? These are like very important questions, but I think we're also transitioning to a period where we actually have to get the very, very specific questions and challenges underneath those underlying broader arguments together. And I just don't think we've quite either inculcated or set the expectation from the top that the job is to really focus on the specific points. But I really agree with what you're saying.
Right. The first, that aggregation. I mean, I think there's a tendency, because everything is so politicized today, to dismiss what a previous administration said, especially if it's from a different party, right? So there's a sense of, they couldn't possibly have been right. So you have to push against that and aggregate. The second step is to assess.
Well, and quick pause there, because before we get into number 2, assess, I think that also describes the opportunity here, because we could have various quibbles with the defense industrial base strategy, but this is now a firmly bipartisan category. I don't think it's easy to imagine back in the 2000s the idea that you would be perfectly within the broad bipartisan center, caring about America's defense industrial base and the need to reform and take action there. I think the real opportunity, though, is that now that we do have the bipartisan consensus, leaders need to step forward and actually do something with that consensus rather than just coast on repeating non-controversial statements like, hey, we have a supply chain problem.
Yeah, exactly. That consensus, it's great, but that means then actually it's a perfect segue to the second step. You need to assess why past efforts failed, right? And actually be honest about that assessment. So if permitting reform is not undertaken, and we know this, there is no point in making more promises about, more mineral processing here, right? It won't happen. So you have to focus on the persistent obstacles that have existed to actually realizing some of these recommendations, to implementing some of these recommendations. What are those consistent, 2 to 5 obstacles that have to be removed in order for progress to be made? If those obstacles are not removed, we are not going to make progress, and we should stop making performative promises, right? So the second part of that assessment should, in theory, be easier with this bipartisan consensus on strengthening our industrial base, and as part of that, reducing our vulnerabilities. We'll see.
Here's something I'm really wondering about then, because once again, we're speaking the same language here in a useful way, assessing why things failed. So I think part of the test here, and you actually reading these reports is key here, is let's say it's the year 2013 or 2011, we're talking about these critical mineral reports during the minerals vulnerability reports in the Obama administration. Did the Obama administration, in fact, seriously put serious policy, intellectual, and just political heft beyond this idea of addressing this issue? Or was this just a well-written report put by someone in middle management that didn't actually go anywhere? Because those are 2 different modes of failure. We tried very, very, very hard to implement these recommendations and they just didn't actually work, versus no one actually tried. I'm like really fascinated by those 2 different categories of policy fail. There's like your policy failed, and then there's your policy process failed. Because to me, a good policy process would translate a problem to a recommendation to a solution.
Yeah. I think that's a good question and a good insight. We don't really assess how hard we've worked to implement something, right? There isn't a formal implementation process across the executive branch. I mean, yes, departments, agencies, organizations within, but there's nothing systematic, that I know of, unless so it's just irregular, I would say. That process of implementation, the process of saying, I've been working really hard on implementing, these 3 recommendations. Here's where I am. I don't see that a lot, right? It's sort of holding, and it kind of goes to some of the other recommendations here, assigning accountability. So we need to do better at that, and leaders within their organizations need to do better at that. So I think it's episodic. I think some leaders will set up a structure to say, okay, I'm going to hold everyone here in the office accountable. keep me apprised of the progress in implementation. And if you run into problems in implementation, let me know, and let's switch to working on reducing those obstacles. But I think your point is correct. It goes back to the first sense of it's easier to set forth the recommendations than it is to actually identify the persistent obstacles to why they're not being implemented or the problems.
So let's get to the third category of recommendation you're offering here.
Right. In keeping with the alliteration of the 4A, aggregate, assess. The third one is authorities. So in our system, our government, is rule of law. People push back on that, but it is. We have a rule of law system, and authorities matter. Has Congress given the executive branch, the Department of Defense, the State Department, the authority to work on a particular set of issues? And that usually comes with, hopefully, the money and the funding to do that. So part of the process in looking at recommendations and the problem of implementation is, are the problems related to authorities? Do I have the authority? Does the Defense Department have the authority to work through a particular problem, to solve for it? Do the authorities exist, but are we not using them, right? Are there interpretations of the law that are being read too narrowly or too broadly? Do you need new authorities to get a particular problem done? So these are sort of ways that you can roll up your sleeves, work at a constructive working level with the relevant congressional committee, and work that out. I think I have a quote in the piece where one of the congressional staffers I spoke to said, we spend a huge amount of time arguing with the department. Half the time we're doing back and forth with the Defense Department, just trying to get them to say who owns what. So that's an example of how there can be a constructive interaction. I'm working now with my colleagues at Hudson, Brian Clark and Dan Patt, on a study related to mobilization. And, it's interesting to hear the perspective from Hill staffers who say, no, DOD, you really can do this. And the Defense Department often saying, well, not so sure we can, which gets to leadership and risk and a whole range of issues that are not new to my piece at all. These are issues that have been discussed for a long time. But working through the authorities, making sure you have them, then helps you understand, it's actually just a question here of leadership, of a willingness to take risk, of a willingness to push through often a stubborn bureaucracy.
And then the fourth one is assigning accountability.
Right. And that sort of goes back to who does what, but it is really important to assign accountability, meaning to assign a particular office, a person, an organization, the job of actually, implementing whatever group of recommendations you're hoping to implement. And sounds obvious, but it's often not done. Also, it sounds simple, but it's often not, because in a whole of government mindset, which is why I actually often have problems with that term, might be sort of sacrilege to say such a thing. But we tend to it's easy to pass blame. Oh, that's the State Department's job. Oh, within DoD, someone else's. Oh, it's Congress. So assigning accountability, you might find that it's not just one organization that's responsible. It might be three, but it's those three, what they each have to do, and then keep them to a timetable so that it gets done. So, and if it doesn't, again, you go back to number 2, assess the obstacles that exist, and then work on removing those obstacles.
So the thing is, as to your point, there are a variety of very important objections to the kind of whole of government framing. But that said, I think one of the reasons why I'm just obsessed with this defense industrial base arsenal of democracy category at a intellectual level is it really is a whole society problem. So if you're talking about workforce development, that clearly extends beyond whatever the Pentagon's doing, and it's going to go into state and local and federal policies relates to education and workforce development. But then there's also conversations around where the private sector fits into this and where outside organizations like Hudson fit in. So I'd just love to hear from you. What is your assessment as someone who dips her toes in a bunch of these different spaces? How would you assess the kind of whole society approach and understanding of these issues is either fitting together or not fitting together well enough? How should we think about that?
Yeah, that's a big question. The reason I don't like whole of government and that mindset is for some of the things that I sort of hinted at here, right? It tends to provide a way to avoid actual accountability, to avoid responsibility, and it doesn't lead to an operational plan. It leads to maybe broad strategy statements, but it doesn't lead to how your organization fits into a broader plan. So I think we need to move, and also it just tends to become very, very bureaucratic, right? Like any sort of, it just becomes process overtakes it. The process of getting everyone to sit around a table to work together. I think we need to move to a shared responsibility framework. And what I mean by that is by imparting a set of objectives to different organizations, but letting them figure out how to get there, right? Which is different. It's different than forcing everyone around a table and working through a process. And again, you spend more time on the process. So I always tend to default to the more individual level, to the principle that I've mentioned and written about before a little bit in some pieces, subsidiarity, right? Going down to the local level to get things done with a sense of shared responsibility and having at that local level, at the state level, or a school district level, here are the outcomes we want, and here is how we're going to get there. So that's sort of the frame I like to use and prefer to whole of government. It doesn't mean that you don't need different actors to work together. Of course you do. But it does mean that you give them the autonomy to figure out how to achieve the goal in their own way. So that's sort of my default preference. Having said that, yes, this industrial-based strategy, it's much more than just what it sounds like. It does involve all components of the private sector, of the American workforce, of a rethinking of principles that drive it, of the role of the state, the role of the government in the economy. So it really captures so many of the issues more than just what its title might think, right? Public-private, the role of manufacturing, the role of government investment, the role of the private sector and private investment. There's a lot in that category today.
And
so you'll have plenty of podcasts to go with. You'll have a lot in the arsenal of democracy.
No, it's true. And I'm excited to kind of expand out. And that's actually a good pivot to kind of the final question here, which genuinely is not meant as a kind of a weird humble brag here, but as you know, like the arsenal of democracy, defense industrial base, critical mineral supply chains categories, like these are seemingly very niche categories. And when we kind of put together the show at Hudson, we kind of assumed like, hey, look, this is a show for policymakers, people who are very in the weeds thinking about these challenges. But recently, I found out that Karl Rove shared one of our very wonky AI national security related episodes out as his like podcast episode of the week to his big listserv, which kind of exposed to me that like, what really differentiates, I think, these categories we're talking about from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s is I think there's actually a broader set of individuals and audiences that are interested in addressing these issues than would be the norm. So once again, there's an opportunity there. But that said, then something I want to do a better job as a host, and I hope you will help me with this, is sort of balancing our need to go niche, aka going through these 4 categories of reform and repetition, while also just being clear to like the new audience that we're bringing in here who's encountering these issues for the first time. What are we actually trying to do here? So let's just like sum up, get out of the weeds and get very specific. Dr. Nadia Schadlow, when you're thinking about this arsenal of democracy category, what are just some generic objectives and goals that you just hold that may rhyme or be the same as the DoD's current Pentagon strategy versus just things that you've just been thinking about in general? Like, what are just some general thoughts that you think would be important to share to an audience if it's engaging with this topic for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally it's to understand, why is the topic important? It is important because the U.S. ability to deter war depends on our ability to produce the capabilities we need to fight and win, should we be presented with war. So ultimately, our ability to deter war depends upon our ability to produce what we need to prevail in conflict. And producing what we need to prevail requires an industrial base, requires the ability to make the platforms, right? To produce the ammunition, to manufacture the components and the parts. So it is very much linked to the broader strategic imperative of deterring war. And if deterrence should fail, and unfortunately, we've seen it fail now twice, right? We've seen it fail in Europe and we've seen it fail in the Middle East. And our ability to deter depends on our ability to convince our adversaries that we actually can produce what we need to fight and win if we need to.
I think that's the perfect way to kind of introduce the topic to folks, because I think if there's one takeaway I want new folks in this space to take from this episode, it's that it's easy to look at the DoD's budget and basically assume things just happen, but they just don't. It'd be easy to say, hey, look, like we passed a massive defense budget bill. We could just assume that we do have enough artillery rounds, or that we are producing the right systems in the right amount, that we have reduced our vulnerabilities when it comes to critical supply and materials. But that just doesn't clearly inherently happen. And I think after 2 or 3 years of conflict in the Middle East and, of course, in Eastern Europe, we just cannot assume these things just happen. So we really need policymakers themselves to take a very active and aggressive approach towards fixing these things, as opposed to just thinking this is just something that will just happen. That's also, once again, another takeaway from the COVID period, where it's easy just to assume, look, we have supply chains, we get what we need, we pay the prices we need to pay. There actually are weird limits if you don't plan properly. So that's just a very, very key takeaway. Dr. Schadlow, that's an excellent place to end the conversation. I'm looking forward to the study you're working on with Brian and Dan, and hopefully we could all join together back on the podcast to discuss it when it is released around the mobilization issue. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thanks so much, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.